right, now that you've had the opportunity to go through the home study, we're going to review the questions together. So go ahead and turn over to page 10 in your workbook, and we'll go over those answers now. The answer for the first question is going to be B, 132,000 gallons. The answer to question 2 is A, 544 gallons per minute. The answer to question 3 is A, 17 square feet. The answer to question 4 is C, 92 pounds. The answer to question 5 is D, 1.5 gallons. The answer to question 6 is B, 13 pounds. The answer to question 7 is C, positive 0.3. The answer to question 8 is D, 75% of the water returns from the surface. The answer to question 9 is C, 4.6 hours. And the answer to question 10 is A, 20 minutes. If your answers did not match up with what you're seeing on the screen, feel free to go back and review the questions on page 10 until you're comfortable with the math. If you need further review, jump back in our previous videos and feel free to go over the math sections again. But today, in this session, we're going to start at the very beginning of our chapter. Now, like we talked about at the very beginning of session 1, we went over the fact that we are not going through the book chapter by chapter. Instead, we're going through it in a more logical sense. The first sessions were all about the operation, what it looks like to work with your pool day in and day out. These second sessions focus on the clerical side of things, making sure that we're above board. So let's go ahead and begin this session with Chapter 1, Pool and Spa Management. Now, this chapter actually starts with classifications of your pool. Now, many codes have abandoned the classification method and instead go directly towards a definition method. Essentially, what this looks like when you thumb through the Colorado State Pool Code, it will start with a listing of definitions. The two biggest ones that you're going to see on there are public and semi-public pools. In many codes, this is also known as commercial or semi-commercial pools. Now, the codes could vary between the two, but the differences are fairly traditional. The commercial properties or public properties, if you have a public pool at your facility, this is a pool that anybody can pay money and gain access to your facility. This is things like our recreational centers that are run through the city and county. This is like our community pools where anybody can pay a fee to get in. Now, our semi-public facilities are facilities like hotels or fitness centers where you pay a fee to get into the hotel itself, and as an amenity, you get access to that swimming pool. Or if you're a member at a fitness center, then you can pay for a gym membership and gain access to the pool as one of those amenities. Now, here's what I'll say. Especially here in the state of Colorado, I highly recommend that you always follow the public code regardless of what your classification is at your property. The reason why I recommend this is because the public code is by far the strictest and most stringent of our codes. And simply put, nobody has ever been sued for being too safe. So again, the safer we can be at our properties, the better we're going to be at our properties and the more peace of mind we're going to have at our properties as well. Now, the remainder of this chapter focuses on something called risk management. Risk management. Now, there are a few different facets that we need to explore when it comes to developing a risk management plan for our properties. First, we're going to talk about negligence, how it's defined, and what it looks like at your property to prevent potential negligence. We're going to do that by exploring how to put together a flawless standard of care that you can follow to avoid negligence at your property. We're then going to talk about your duty in light of the standard of care that you've created. And then finally, we're going to talk one last time about record keeping. Now, let's first look at the definition of negligence. According to your book, negligence is defined as the failure to act in accordance with the corresponding standard of care. Now, we haven't talked about a standard of care yet, so we're not fully aware of what a standard of care looks like. But in a nutshell, a standard of care is a plan that you put together and you work day in and day out executing that plan. So in the simplest of terms, we can see negligence as the result of not working this plan. We've now taken something that's abstract to something that is concrete. The thing that's really nice about this is we no longer have guesswork. Once we put together an excellent strategy at our property, we have that great plan together, we can execute it on a day in and day out basis and know that we are avoiding negligence every single day at our properties. Now, let's explore this standard of care. The first part of the standard of care is the creation of an opening and closing checklist. Now turn with me quickly over to page 240 in your book. On page 240, you're going to see a sample opening and closing checklist. Now the nice thing is, this isn't just a sample. This can actually be the blueprint that you use at your property. Simply Xerox this page and use it day in and day out. I love this example opening and closing checklist, especially for those of you who are brand new to this job. This prevents any gray area from occurring. A lot of times we'll show up and they'll just say, hey, clean the pool. And you might be left thinking, oh, well, how do I do that? This opening and closing checklist is going to help you understand exactly where you start and where you finish, both in the opening and the closing of your facility. Now, for some of you, not everything on this list may apply. So instead, use the items that do apply and make your own list from this list. Now, another thing that I will mention is obviously we've created this standard of care to be in broad terms. In no way am I, unfortunately, able to zero in on each one of your properties and tell you exactly what you need to create for your standard of care. In this entire section, I'm giving you the broad strokes, the overview of what you need to do at your property. And while you're listening to this, I highly recommend that you be thinking about your property actively and how you can bend and tweak this and add things to make your property as safe as possible when it comes to your day-to-day operation. The next facet of the standard of care is creating a color-coded pump room diagram. They stipulate that you need to have one of these inside your pump room and somewhere outside of your pump room, like at your front desk or in the maintenance room. They'll need this color-coded pump room diagram if there ever is an emergency situation inside that pump room, or they need to breach that pump room door. So again, make sure that you have a color-coded pump room diagram inside of the pump room on the wall and somewhere outside of the facility, whether it's in the main office or in your facility's tech room. Next, equipment manuals. Make sure you hold on to these. These are really, really robust in a lot of situations inside of the pool industry. In fact, the equipment manuals for things like our pumps and motors will give you schematics on 100% tear down and rebuilds on all of your motors. Is this me recommending that you be able to tear down and rebuild your motor? By all means, no. But what I am saying is if you ever need to troubleshoot, this is a great place to start. Another thing that you'll see inside your equipment manuals is great warranty information. So make sure you're holding on to those equipment manuals. If I were you, I would just get a single 3-ring binder and put all of those equipment manuals in the same binder. Now make sure that you're tracking everything through your records. Any equipment that you purchase, any repairs that you make, any maintenance that you perform on that pool, make sure you're writing it down. Another facet of the standard of care is the proper training of you and your fellow staff members. Now, I'm not extremely concerned about this because you are going through CPO training at this moment. But there may be other people at your property who are required to go through CPO training as well. So maybe if I were you, I would alert my management team that other people may need to go through this class. They, as managers themselves, may benefit from going through this class, and in some situations may be legally obligated to go through classes like this or equivalent classes out there when it comes to specialized information that they need to have to better equip them for their position. Now, next, we're going to talk about the emergency response plan. Now, because all of your properties are extremely diverse and every one of your job descriptions is even more diverse, I'm just going to give you extremely broad strokes in this area and have you go back to your property and customize it as much as you can. Essentially, you need to be trained to know what to do, you need to be trained how to do it, and you need to know when it's appropriate. You need to be trained what to do, you need to know how to do it, and you need to know when it's appropriate. Again, this is about as far as I'm going to take that because each one of you will need to go back to your property and know exactly what your job description requires you to do in the event of a myriad of emergencies at your property. Now let's talk about safety equipment. Now, the way I'm going to talk about this is as though all of these safety equipment pieces are required by your local code, simply because these are adopted standards across the board. So the vast majority of our health codes across the United States and worldwide, if there is a code in your country, will require the majority of these pieces of safety equipment. What I would recommend is check your local code to make sure that all of the information that we cover here coincides with what you see in your local code. Now, the first one that is required by code is a Coast Guard or Underwriters Laboratories approved life ring. It needs to be installed, hung up on a hook that is no higher than 36 inches off the ground. The life ring also needs to have a rope attached to it. The general rule of thumb is that this rope is the length and a half of your facility, a length and a half of the facility itself. Many of our local codes also stipulate that you have one life ring per body of water. That means if you have a pool and a hot tub, you have a life ring for the pool and you have a life ring for the hot tub. The code also stipulates that you are legally required to have a straight, non-telescopic pole between 12 and 16 feet long, and it needs to have that shepherd's hook permanently installed on the end of that hook. Now, my recommendation with this is that you install this somewhere at your facility that's visible from the pool area and accessible by all by being hung up no higher than 36 inches off the ground. That means the hooks that it hangs from are no higher than 36 inches off the ground, and then hang your life ring from one of those hooks that's holding up your shepherd's hook pole. It's a little bit of a one-stop safety shop in that way. Now, again, notice how I said that the code only requires this in one area. That's because it doesn't require it per body of water. It requires this shepherd's hook, one per facility itself. Now, obviously, do a safety audit of your own when you get to your property. And if you have a larger facility and it benefits you to have two shepherd's hooks like this, then do your due diligence and put two shepherd's hooks in. Now, the next thing on the list are backboard. Backboards aren't required by most codes. In fact, if you have a backboard at your property and you don't have staff members who are updated and trained on how to use this, I highly recommend you get rid of the backboard altogether. There's no need for it. In fact, the latest medical evidence shows that if you are able to stabilize the victim until first responders get there, that's actually ideal instead of using a backboard yourself. Now, back in the early 90s, these were being handed out left and right. As a result, one of those old, nasty backboards might be hiding somewhere at your property. If this is the case and you don't have somebody like lifeguards or you yourself are not certified to use it, I highly recommend you just pitch it. No reason to have it. Unless, of course, your local code requires it. Now, an automatic electronic defibrillator, or an AED. At this time, these aren't required by code here in our local area of Colorado, but they may be part of your code in your local area, so make sure that you check before you do anything. But these can be great life-saving devices. I will also say that you need to be very careful on where you install these and who is authorized to use these. The only person who is authorized to use these is somebody who has been certified, trained, and signed off to use the AED at your property. These are not for general use. These are not for the general public. These are only people for people who are technically able to use them and legally documented to use them as well. So if your property has AEDs and they want you to use them, make sure that you are certified to use that if that's part of your job description. Now, next is an emergency phone. Emergency phone is required by code. It stipulates that that emergency phone be wired directly to emergency responders. So for those of us in the hospitality industry, that courtesy phone that we have in the pool area, unfortunately, is not sufficient to match what the code requires. They require that that phone patch directly to first responders so that the first responders can get to the site as quickly as possible. That 30-second relay between the courtesy phone and the front desk could mean the difference between life and death. So we need to make sure that those phones tap directly into our emergency responders. I also highly recommend that once a month, you pick that phone up, make sure that it works, and you just will put the call through to 911 and say, this is just a technician at so-and-so property ensuring that our phone works in the event of an emergency. So again, like I said, make sure you're testing these because a lot of times health inspectors are not going to be inspecting these because they're already very busy, but we want to ensure that those are as safe and compliant as possible. Now, finally, an emergency shutoff switch is required by code. Now, here in the state of Colorado, it's a little bit of a gray area with this emergency shutoff switch. Our code is fairly ironclad except for in this emergency shutoff switch area. The code reads that an emergency shutoff switch is required, but it needs to be hidden away from public access in some place like the lifeguard shack. Now, I highly recommend that you do not follow that advice. I know that sounds a little bit shocking, but here's what I want you to keep in mind. In certain situations, a legal requirement can be superseded by an industry standard if the industry standard is more strict than the legal requirement. Again, I will say that an industry standard can supersede a legal requirement in a court of law if the standard is found to be more strict than the legal code. In this situation, we default back to the Model Aquatic Health Code, or the MAC. Now, the Model Aquatic Health Code was written by the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, in conjunction with the National Swimming Pool Foundation and the Pool and Hot Tub Alliance. Now, this code is the most comprehensive code that we have in the world, in fact. It's updated every 2 years by a symposium of health inspectors around the world, and it's made sure that this is the most up-to-date and comprehensive document at your disposal. The good news is you actually have a free download copy if you go over to poolstrainingacademy.com, search for that codes and resources page, and you'll see a link over to the Model Aquatic Health Code. Once you follow that link, it will allow you to download the latest edition of the Model Aquatic Health Code, weighing in at a hefty 199 pages long. The nice thing about the Model Aquatic Health Code, there are very, very, very few gray areas. In fact, this emergency shutoff switch area is not gray whatsoever. It states that the emergency shutoff switch needs to be in the pool area, visible from the bodies of water, and available to the general public at any given time. The reason why is like we talked about young William Boulay in our entrapment chapter. If William Boulay's mother was able to have access to that emergency shutoff switch within a couple of seconds, there's a very good chance that William Boulay would not need to be on feeding tubes for the rest of his life. Also, in the event of electrocution or any other issues that could happen inside of your pool area, you need to have your swimmers able to get to that emergency shutoff switch to shut it down when necessary. So, in a nutshell, make sure that you're getting those emergency shutoff switches installed inside of the pool area for the pool and for the hot tub. Now, I'm going to give you a couple of freebies here. Make sure you write these down because these questions could be confusing once they come upon the test. Remember that according to the test, all routine maintenance should be done before the pool opens each day. According to the exam, all routine maintenance should be done before the pool opens each day. Now, you may be given one of your multiple choice options of at any time this should be performed. Now, you're going to be thinking to yourself, well, if there's something that needs to get done, of course I'm going to do it. But according to the exam, the routine maintenance should be done before the pool opens each day. They're including things like chemical adjustment in your routine maintenance. But the other thing that we need to remember is according to our health departments like Tri-County Health here in Denver, Colorado, they require that your chemical adjustment occur over a 6-hour turnover period so that chemical can fully dissolve and disperse. So don't let that confuse you. Make sure you write this one down. Now, the next one you're going to want to write down is that the first thing that you should be checking is the deck area and the pool, according to the exam. The correct answer, according to the exam, is the first thing that you should be checking is the deck area and pool. One of your other options is going to be gates and barriers. Now, you're going to use common sense and say, well, the first thing that I interact with at my property is the gate and barrier. So that's the obvious answer. Well, unfortunately, that's not the obvious answer. To you and I, yes, it's the most logical, straightforward, and true answer. But on the test itself, the answer is the deck area and the pool. I think that the writers of the test assume that you have teleportation skills, and you can teleport from your car into the pool area, look over the deck area and the pool, and then go back out to the gate. So make sure that you don't get confused on this one. The first thing you should be checking is the deck area and the pool. When you've got those emergency shutoff switches, make sure you've got signs above them that let everybody know what that big red button does. It will mitigate accidental pushing, and in an emergency situation, it will be so bright and so loud that people will know exactly where to go to shut off those facilities. Now, with our safety signage, make sure that it's up and it's visible. If you don't have lifeguards, people need to know about it. Now, when it comes to your safety signage on the depth and no diving markers, those depth and no diving markers can have no less than a 4-inch size. No less than a 4-inch size on those. Also, make sure that they're adhered up on the coping stones on the deck, as well as in the inside of the tiles for our swimmers inside the pool to read. Wherever there's no diving, make sure that it's got an accompanying no diving tile. Now, check your local municipal code before installing these because they may bar you from doing something like a stencil or a sticker version. They may require you to grout it in. So like I said, make sure you check your local code before you install these on your deck. Now, another thing to keep in mind, as you can see in our picture in the bottom right corner there, we've got the metric system installed. I don't think this is a bad practice. If you are under fair housing laws, though, you are forbidden from putting any metric system on your facility. So keep that in mind. Anybody who's under the laws of fair housing is not allowed to put metric. Anybody else, I think that that's a great thing to consider, especially to warn your international travelers of the depth of your facility. Now next, when it comes to your safety signage, I highly recommend that you call your health department. Be proactive. Call them up and say, hey, what exactly do you require of us for our safety signage? And they'll give you a list of standardized elements that you need to include. Then from there, what I recommend is you take a safety audit at your property. If there's anything unique that the health department didn't cover that will help cover you from any potential liability, add it to the sign before it gets made. Also, make sure that you have on there that the failure to adhere to these rules will result in expulsion from the pool area. Your swimmers need to know that there will be consequences if they break your rules. Now, with your hazard signage, make sure that your hazardous signage is up on all of the doors that are protecting your pump room and that are housing your chemicals. Now, this is just an overall overview of your standard of care. Like I said, make sure that you're taking notes and auditing your own property when you get back to your property to make sure that you're covering all of your bases. Now that we understand this standard of care, we can get a better understanding of our duty of care. The book says that us as pool operators have a duty to act with reasonable care towards patrons and staff so as not to create an unreasonable risk or harm. Our goal is to prevent any sort of unreasonable risk or harm from occurring at our properties. As long as we are following our ironclad standard of care that we have created and we're tweaking as we go to become as safe as possible, you got nothing to worry about. Everything is fine at your property. But again, make sure that you are actively working on that standard of care on a regular basis to make sure that you are covering all of your bases. Now, when it comes to record keeping, we've talked about this here and there, but I highly recommend that you keep every single record of everything you do. If you do something at your property, document it. One of the big things that I recommend is once you get back to your property, you've probably noticed that there's a lot of things at your property that is out of compliance after this class. My recommendation is you sit down and write an email to your supervisor that says, hey, thanks for sending me through CPO training. I learned a lot in the process. One of the things that I learned is that we're out of compliance on the following. And you list off everything that has a compliance issue that goes against what we talk about here in class. At the end, say, please let me know how you'd like to respond to all these things, and we'll get a schedule together to get them taken care of. You send that off, and this is your get out of jail free cards, my friends. The best case scenario is you're going to get an email back from that supervisor that says, thank you so much for alerting me to these issues. Let's go ahead and start with this one and move down the line, so on and so on and so forth. Then from there, you have the obligation to follow through. Do all those things on the list and get your property up to compliance. A more likely scenario, though, is you're not going to hear anything back from your supervisor. And in that situation, if there ever is a liability situation that comes up and they try to pin it back on you, you now have paper documentation to say, I've been doing my due diligence at this property and I've received no communication, no reciprocity in that situation. So again, like I said, we're hoping to get an email back. And if we do get that email back, then the obligation is on us equally. We make sure that we get the job done, we make our property as safe as possible, and everybody's good to go. Again, as long as you can get it in writing, you're safer and you're better. Make sure that we are documenting how we have fulfilled our standard of care through the execution of our paperwork. Be sure to write down any questions that you may have that came up during this chapter for us to address in the Q&A session. Chapter 2, Regulations and Guidelines. Chapter 2. Now, in this chapter, what we've done is we've actually compiled all the crucial websites on our own website. So make sure that you're jumping over to pooltrainingacademy.com, going to that codes and resources page, and checking out all of the different links that we've provided to you to the crucial agencies and websites that they accompany in order to get the most information possible. Now let's talk about the difference between regulations and standards. A regulation is mandatory. It's legally required. A standard is considered a best practice that's created by a given industry. For ours, it's the pool and spa industry. Now let's first talk about regulations. Our first regulator is our local health departments. Our local health departments are a great source for our knowledge and understanding about how we need to be operating our facilities. Now here's the nice thing is our local health departments are operating on no secrets, my friends. The code that they are following is publicly posted. If you request a copy of their code, they are constantly updating them, and they should be able to provide that for you. Now, my philosophy when it comes to health inspectors is this. There are two ways to operate our facilities. Our first option is we operate in fear of a bad health inspection. We say, okay, well, they checked this and this and this last time, so let's make sure that this and this and this are good this time so we get a clean bill of health and we can move on. But the problem is, every inspector is different and may not inspect the exact same things. So as a result, you could get a negative health inspection the next time that an inspector comes out. Another thing to think about is our health inspectors may be busy and they may not be providing a comprehensive inspection at your property. So, in my opinion, the second view or approach to this is significantly more preferable. The approach that I like to follow at the properties that I work with is I am going to work as safe and healthy at my property. And as a result of this safe and healthy operation, I am always going to get a positive health review. There's never any tricks, there's never any surprises, and even if they don't inspect something, I can know that I am still compliant because I'm following my health and safety requirements given to me by my state and local code. So again, this gives you a reason not to fear when the health inspector shows up, but it gives you peace of mind that when they show up, you're going to automatically get a great inspection. Now let's talk about the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. They're going to be regulating two things in our industry. The first is the labeling of our products, and the second is something called SARA Title III. Now, when it comes to the labeling of our products, we've got danger, we've got warning, and we've got caution. Danger says that this chemical could potentially kill you. Warning says this chemical could potentially make it so you feel like you want to die. And caution basically says this is going to irritate skin, eyes, so on and so forth. Now, the reason why I brush over these is because I look at the label as good to know information, but I look at our SDS sheets as need to know information. Make sure that you have access to your SDS sheets and you're following those when it comes to proper required PPE for interaction with those chemicals. Now, next, we're going to be talking about the SARA Title III. SARA Title III is also known as the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act. This act says that we as employees and as human beings have the right to know the dangers of the chemicals that we're using at our properties and our jobs day to day. This means that we as operators must have access to the SDS sheets at all times during working hours. It also says that we need to have a plan put together for any potential accidental chemical release. Now that automatically makes us think, oh my word, this is pressure and a half to try to come up with a plan to deal with any sort of leaks or spills that may happen. But don't worry, your SDS sheets all provide that plan already. So if there's ever an accidental chemical release at your property, just check your SDS sheets and it will tell you exactly what you need to do. Next, we're going to be talking about OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. Now, OSHA is going to be looking over general employee safety, but over all of us, it's going to be overlooking the SDS compliance. This used to be formerly MSDS. These MSDS, the Material Safety Data Sheets, were the king of the area of our expertise, which is the pool and spa industry. These would tell us all the information we needed to know about the chemicals that we were using. But as of 2015, the MSDS has officially changed over to the SDS. Now, the difference between MSDS and SDS is that our SDS sheets have now been required to follow something called the GHS, or the Globally Harmonized System. This means that all of our SDS sheets need to follow the exact same format as one another, and it makes life a lot easier when interacting with those SDS sheets as an employee. Now, a couple of things to remember is one, employees must be formally trained to read and understand these SDS sheets. You need to be legally trained and signed off and have documentation at your property that you have access to your SDS sheets and you've been trained to read and interact with them. These SDS sheets must also be current, so make sure that there's somebody at your property checking on a regular basis to make sure that those SDS sheets are up to date. These SDS sheets need to be kept in employee access during all working hours, and this is the doozy, my friends. Master copies need to be stored in a secure location for 30 years after the last use of that chemical. That's unbelievable. Again, I'll say it. Master copies need to be stored in a secure location for 30 years after the last use. We're talking everything from dial soap in the bathrooms all the way to our most harmful and caustic chemicals inside of our pump rooms. They all need to have SDS sheets on the property, and they all need to be kept behind lock and key once they are no longer being used. So, again, this doesn't fall on the majority of us. This falls on our general managers to make sure that they are compliant at their properties. Now, again, remember, this class is taught by just a pool guy. This is for educational purposes only. If you are worried about your site's compliance, I highly recommend talking to your legal team to make sure that you are compliant with your SDS requirements. Speaking of legal compliance, let's talk about the Department of Justice, the DOJ. Turn back to page 275 in your books. We're going to explore the ADA requirements from specifically the ADA laws of 2010. The ADA laws of 2010 affect specifically our swimming facilities. As you can see on the bottom right-hand corner, it's going to tell you exactly who is required. That is, all facilities that are public or semi-public. They require that at least 2 forms of accessible entry be allowed in public pools. Now, they then go on to give you the list of all the different options that you have for that compliance. And then below that, it gives an exception. It says that if there are less than 300 linear feet of pool wall, you are allowed to have only 1 form of accessible entry, and it gives the suggestions and recommendations for the 1 form of accessible entry. Now, a couple of things to remember about this. First and foremost, I believe, just like with our health departments, the ADA law can be approached in 2 different ways. One way can be that we're really grumpy and bitter because we're afraid that somebody's going to try to sue us, and so we're going to try to be as compliant with the law as possible to avoid getting sued. But there's also, in my opinion, the preferable view. The spirit behind this law is pure, my friends. The spirit behind this law says that everybody has the right to enjoy a fun day at the pool. And when I think about a 12-year-old kid who struggles day in and day out with cerebral palsy, he has every right, or she has every right, to get into the pool and enjoy the day with their siblings. So let's step up and give them the ability to get into the pool with their friends and their family. To me, the second of these 2 approaches allows me to approach this with a joy, with the ability to know that I am making somebody's life directly better. I'm enhancing their day by complying with this ADA law. Now, this is very nuanced. It's very specific. So what I highly recommend is, if you do have questions with this, make sure that you are talking with legal counsel on your compliance. Because again, all of our properties have different requirements, and some of our properties have certain exemptions that other properties don't. My recommendation is that in your email that you send off to your higher authority, that you include this and say, just want to make sure that we are 100% ADA compliant and it's been checked off by the legal team. Next, let's talk about the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control. Now, the CDC in our world is primarily concerned with prevention of recreational water illnesses. They're going to provide resources for the handling of all of our various health-related issues. And you're going to be seeing all of the ways that they recommend that you respond to these on their website at healthyswimming.org. Again, that's healthyswimming.org. They're going to give you some invaluable resources on that website that will help you on a day-to-day basis at your property. These are going to cover things like vomit and blood contamination of pool water. This is something that we think that we're never going to interact with, but believe it or not, both of those incidents are way more common than you would ever imagine. So jump over to healthyswimming.org and check out what they have to say about these various topics. Again, the CDC might sound familiar because we talked earlier in this session that they are responsible for building the Model Aquatic Health Code. That Model Aquatic Health Code comes in 14 modules. Again, like I said, this is a very beefy and robust code, and it is 100% free and accessible to every single one of you. So I highly recommend that you go to our website and download a copy of the Model Aquatic Health Code for your own reference and for you to follow at your property. Now let's move our focus over to our standards. Remember, standards are considered recommended guidelines. These standards are created by the pool and spa industry. Now, the way this generally works is our standards are, once they've been adopted all the way across an industry, they then regularly turn into legal requirements. So the majority of our health codes started out as standards given to us by the professionals in our industry. So when you see standards, you can know that those are getting adopted across an industry. They're probably going to be likely adopted into code eventually. Now again, like I covered already, making sure that you're following the standards out there is going to help you understand how safe you need to be at your property, because a standard can supersede a regulation if the regulation is less stringent than the standard. But again, you're not having to scramble all over the place when it comes to health and safety. You're going back to the Model Aquatic Health Code to make sure that your local code is as strict, stringent, and comprehensive as the Model Aquatic Health Code. Now, our standard setters are as follows: the Association of Pool and Spa Professionals and the American National Standards Institute, also known as the APSP and the ANSI. These two are traditionally responsible for developing the standards for the design and workmanship of our anti-entrapment drain devices. Now, again, something to keep in mind is the Association of Pool and Spa Professionals and the National Swimming Pool Foundation have merged together to create the Pool and Hot Tub Alliance. So I am not exactly sure if APSP and ANSI are going to be partnering on these standards any longer. I do know that somebody will be in charge of the standards that are created for compliance on our anti-entrapment drain covers, but it might just not be the APSP and the ANSI. It could be somebody like the ASME and the ANSI. So keep an eye out on the local trade papers to see developments in this area. Next is our National Sanitation Foundation, the NSF. Now, the NSF is a voluntary standard-setting program that can appear on all of your, it's recommended that it appears on all of your devices and all of your equipment inside of your pump room. So the way the NSF works is a manufacturer is going to design a piece of equipment. They will then send it off to the NSF, and the NSF puts it through what's called their Standard 50. And that 50 standard is designed specifically for the pool and spa industry. It goes through rigorous tests to make sure that it can withstand all of the different situations that we can put it through. If it passes that rigorous test, then it is given the NSF sticker, that NSF rating. My recommendation, and the recommendation of Pool Training Academy as well as the Pool and Hot Tub Alliance, is that all of the equipment that you purchase be either NSF or Underwriters Laboratories approved. Underwriters Laboratories is another independent nonprofit public product safety testing and certification group. They actually do look at various different pieces of equipment across your property and make sure that they're all as safe as possible. So we are looking to purchase either NSF, UL, or some equivalent certification organization that has made sure that the equipment that we're purchasing is as safe to use as possible. And then finally, the National Fire Protection Association, also known as the NFPA. The NFPA is going to give us our standards on the storage of our liquid and solid oxidizers. Now, one thing to keep in mind is the NFPA standards have been adopted in different ways in different municipalities, states, and local regions. For instance, here in the state of Colorado, the NFPA has adopted the ban that NFPA has put out about storing your liquid and solid oxidizers, or any chemicals for that matter, inside of your pump room. So make sure that you're checking your state and local code to see how the NFPA has affected especially the storage of your chemicals. Now, this is going to come down to your specific health inspector and what they require. Some are going to allow you to put this inside of a protective Rubbermaid shed or something like that, or they're going to require that you put this in a different room altogether. My recommendation is do what they direct you to do, and you'll be good to go. You can also find what you need to put inside of the hazard diamonds that go on all of the doors that protect your chemicals at the NFPA's website, and you'll also be able to get a copy of the National Electrical Code there as well. Remember to write down any questions that you have that came up during this section and ask them during the Q&A portion. Chapter 4, Pool Water Contamination. When it comes to pool water contamination, we're looking to avoid the spread of any potential pathogens. Pathogens are bacteria, viruses, or protozoa that float inside of our water, and if left unregulated and undisinfected, can severely harm or even lead to death inside of our swimmers. Now, the way that this works is fairly simple. All our swimmers have to do is interact with contaminated water. That may look like swallowing, breathing, or simply interacting with it, whether it is in water vapor form or they get a drop on their lip and they inadvertently lick it off. If that's contaminated with protozoa, then they can become infected. Now, the other thing to keep in mind with this is, when was the last time that we got, say, the stomach flu, and we thought, this must be from the swimming pool? We rarely think that. Instead, we always go back to food or who we've been around. And so as a result of this, a lot of our outbreak information is either underreported or rarely pins back to our swimming pool facilities. So we need to make sure that we are keeping our properties as clean as possible so we're not contributing to high levels of disease or illnesses like gastroenteritis. Now, the first thing we're going to be talking about here is fecal-related illnesses. According to a CDC study, people have approximately 0.14 grams of fecal matter on their buttocks when they enter your pool. Yes, that's disgusting, and yes, it is scientifically accurate. What does this look like? Roughly about the size of a pea. Now, the thing that we have to keep in mind with this is we can't regulate exactly how well somebody has bathed when they've gotten into our pool. So instead, we as operators need to be proactive. We need to be proactive. Education on this is great. Telling people that they're washing not to get rid of just body oils and hair products, but to get rid of fecal contaminant is great information. But the majority of people out there are going to say, I'm not one of those people. I don't need to do that. So they'll just jump in without showering. So we need to be proactive and assume that people are not going to follow their cleanliness guidelines. Proactivity looks like making sure our water is disinfected at 4 parts per million of chlorine at all times. Now, the way that this whole process works is somebody brings that feces into the water, whether it's a guest or an animal. An animal could be flying overhead. You could have waterfowl that goes down into your water and defecates into the pool. There's a bunch of different possibilities of this from happening inside of your water. But regardless, that feces is entered into the water, and then a guest gets either just a gulp, a mouthful, or some on their lip, and it's contaminated, and they lick it off. It's that simple. This is called the fecal oral route. Maybe one of the grossest phrases ever made in the human language. And now we're going to explore all of the different issues that can come through this fecal oral route. The first is our parasitic contaminants. The first one we're going to talk about is cryptosporidium. Now, if you remember cryptosporidium from earlier sessions, cryptosporidium is very difficult to kill off with chlorine. And if we recall, the evidence is inconclusive that it will even be killed off whatsoever from chlorine. So we need to make sure that we are using C-Clear PRS, that particulate removal system, that's going to beef up our filters from a certain microbic level that they're already set at down to a 0.5 microbic level. So remember, we are looking to prevent any sort of cryptosporidium from growing in our water, so we're going to filter it out using C-Clear PRS. The next on our list is going to be very similar to cryptosporidium. It's Giardia. Now, Giardia still contains an outer shell just like cryptosporidium, but it's not nearly as resistant to chlorine disinfection. If you look on page 41 of your books, you're going to see that German activation chart that we referenced earlier. we'll see that with Giardia, if we are at a 1 part per million residual chlorine inside of our pool, Giardia is killed off in 45 minutes. But remember, we are not keeping our chlorine levels at 1 part per million in our facilities. We are keeping them at 4 parts per million. So if we're keeping it at 4 parts per million, we're going to see a significantly quicker inactivation time with our Giardia. So make sure that we keep those chlorine levels up, friends, because we want to prevent these from spreading as quickly as possible. Now, with our bacterial contaminants, the first one we're going to talk about is Shigella. Now, Shigella is mostly caused through the fecal-oral route. It can be present in feces up to 2 weeks after the diarrhea ceases. So this is why on the majority of our safety signs, we're going to see that it says, anybody who has diarrhea or has had diarrhea in the last 2 weeks should not be using the pool area. It's to prevent the spread of Shigella because children 2 to 4 years old are by far the most at risk. Symptoms on this are not fun, my friends, and we don't want our little ones being exposed to Shigella. So as long as we keep our proper disinfection levels at 4 parts per million, you will never see a case of Shigella come from your swimming facility. Next on the list, we've got the dreaded E. coli. Now, E. coli is what I like to call a rock star illness. And what I mean by that is whenever there is an outbreak of E. coli, every news agency makes sure that everybody in the world knows about it. Now, here's the interesting thing, is look again on page 41 at that German activation chart, and you'll see how quickly E. coli is killed off in chlorinated water. If you look at the chart, you'll see that it's killed off in 1 part per million of chlorine in less than 1 minute. And we're keeping our chlorine at 4 parts per million, so it's going to take just a couple of seconds before our chlorine kills off this E. coli, and you never have to worry about it in your property ever. So again, you see why I'm so adamant that keeping those chlorine levels at 4 parts per million is so important. Now let's talk about our viruses. First is norovirus. Now, norovirus is actually a grouping of viruses that's found in either stool or vomit, and it is highly, highly contagious. The good thing to remember is our chlorine will kill off norovirus at about the same rate as it kills off Giardia. So as long as we are keeping our chlorine levels up at 4 parts per million, we will rarely see any cases from norovirus coming from the pool. Next, we're going to talk about adenovirus. Adenovirus commonly affects the pulmonary system, but it can also cause things like gastroenteritis, pink eye, or cause skin rashes. Now, the nice thing is, as long as we're keeping those chlorine levels up at 4 parts per million, we're going to obliterate adenovirus inside of our water. So again, we're seeing that theme of keeping our chlorine levels up as much as possible. And then finally, we're going to talk about hepatitis A. Hepatitis A. Now, hepatitis A is the only strain that's transmitted through feces, and as you can see, it's got a laundry list of rough symptoms. Now, those symptoms can take a long time to show up, and some carriers may not even know that they have it. But I will say this, if we look at our German activation time on hepatitis A found on page 41, we're going to see that as long as we keep those chlorine levels up at 4 parts per million, hepatitis A is going to be killed off in just a couple of minutes. So again, make sure our chlorine levels are up. Now, before we move on from this area, I do want to address the coronavirus or COVID-19 that can be found all over the world right now. In our swimming pools, we do not need to worry about coronavirus inside of the water so long as we keep our chlorine levels in adequate range. That is between 1 and 4 parts per million. Again, I'm going to be very adamant that you all keep your chlorine levels at 4 parts per million because the higher we keep our chlorine, the more quickly things like coronavirus are killed off. Make sure that you are keeping your levels up, and if you want further resources on chlorine's interaction with COVID-19 or the family of coronaviruses, jump over to our website, check out our articles section, and we have a very informative article that talks all about how easily the family of coronavirus is killed off by chlorine. So again, if you are having questions about that, don't hesitate to write those down for us to talk about during the Q&A section, because I'm more than happy to go more in depth. But I do have the good news that chlorine obliterates coronavirus. Now let's move on to our fecal response. If somebody does defecate inside of our pool, what do? I highly recommend that you write these steps down. First, step number 1. Always make sure that we're getting everybody out of the pool. Everybody out of the pool. We don't swim them away from the feces, from the poo. Instead, we make sure that everybody gets out of the pool. Next, we're going to remove that material. Make sure that we're getting out of the water, and make sure that you're keeping it in as localized an area as possible to make sure that you're not furthering the spread of potential pathogens in your water. Once you've removed the material, place that equipment that you used to remove the material inside the water itself. Once we get to the chemical disinfection section, that equipment will be disinfected by the chemicals that we add to the pool. So just throw them directly in the pool and they will be disinfected. And speaking of chemical treatment, let's now figure out exactly what we need to do in each given in each fecal response that we're given. First, we're going to talk about a formed stool, a solid poo, friends. What do we do when we see a solid stool? Well, it's going to be quite simple. We're going to raise our chlorine levels to 2 parts per million, but if we remember in our pools, we're keeping those chlorine levels at 4 parts per million, so there's no need to raise it. We're already above the minimum requirement. But if for some odd reason you find yourself below the 2 parts per million, make sure that you raise that up to 2 parts per million. Then from there, you're going to maintain a pH of 7.5 or less. The reason why we're keeping a lower pH is simply to make sure that our chlorine is as effective as possible, because chlorine is more effective at releasing hypochlorous acid in a lower pH environment than in a higher pH environment. We're then going to maintain a temperature of 77 degrees or higher. The reason why we're keeping this temperature higher than 77 degrees is our Giardia is killed off in higher temperature water faster than lower temperature water. And then finally, we're going to maintain this for 30 minutes. Maintain this for 30 minutes. Once you've done all of this, make sure that you're writing it down, you're documenting what you've done, and after that 30-minute period, you are more than welcome to open back up. If you choose to close for an hour, that's your call. If you choose to close for the rest of the day, that's your call. But our code requires that we only close for 30 minutes so long as we are following the protocols on the screen right now. Next, we're going to talk about diarrhea. Now, if there is a diarrheal incident at your property, I'm going to show you the steps that you are required to take that the test requires on the screen. And then once we write those down, I'm going to talk about what you actually need to do at your properties. So according to the test, first what you're going to do is raise your chlorine to 20 parts per million. Raise your chlorine up to 20 parts per million. Then you're going to maintain that pH of 7.5 or less. You're going to maintain a temperature of 77 degrees or higher. And you're going to maintain that level for 12.75 hours. If you need to pause the video and write these down, please do so. But now let's talk about exactly what you need to do in real life compared to what the test says. First and foremost, you want to check your local code to see if there's a differentiation in that 12.75 hours of time. Some codes will require a 24-hour closure. Some will be just fine with the 12.75. But the huge thing that you want to do is make sure that you're checking your local code to see how long that germ inactivation time is required in the local code. We also have the knowledge that Cryptosporidium is not killed off by chlorine. The reason why we're responding to diarrheal incidents this way is simply because a CDC study saw that all Cryptosporidium cases of fecal contamination occurred inside diarrheal contaminant. So we are assuming that all of our diarrhea is caused by Cryptosporidium. But if that's the case, we also need to do one other crucial step, which is add our C-Clear PRS to our water. You can either manually add this or you can set it up to be automated so you can kick it in constantly to make sure that it's keeping your water as clean as possible. So again, we're following the steps that we see on the screen, except for the fact that we're maintaining for 24 hours, and we're also adding C-Clear PRS. Now we've also got another hiccup possible at our properties, and that's the use of cyanuric acid. If you look on page 41 of your books, you're going to see that if we're using cyanuric acid inside of our facilities, anywhere above 10 to 15 parts per million, we are going to need to close for 28 hours and raise our chlorine up to 20 parts per million for that 28-hour period. If we're anywhere between 1 and 15 parts per million, that's how long we need to close. But if we are above 1 to 15 parts per million of cyanuric acid in our facility, the book stipulates that we're required to drain our pools partially until we reach the 1 to 15 parts per million and refill the pool and then start our clock. That is a very, very hefty order, especially on our larger facilities. So here's what I recommend. Limit the use of cyanuric acid. Again, as we've seen throughout this entire presentation, cyanuric acid causes a lot more problems than it solves. So, make sure that we are following all of the requirements, not just what's written in the book, but what is given to us by our local state and community codes. Once we've fulfilled those duties, we're going to lower our disinfectant levels back to safe levels by adding that product, sodium thiosulfate. Make sure that you always have sodium thiosulfate on hand because it's going to help you drop your chemical levels of chlorine very, very quickly. Also bear in mind that if your chlorine levels drop below 20 parts per million during any time of that chlorination period, you are required to restart that 24 or 28-hour clock and begin again. Make sure that you're filling out all of your logs. Make sure that everybody knows that you did what you were supposed to do, how you were supposed to do it, and when you were supposed to do it. Now let's shift away from fecal-related illnesses to non-fecal-related illness. The first one we're going to talk about is Pseudomonas, aka hot tub rash. With Pseudomonas, you're going to see this showing up in places like the armpit, the groin, or areas covered by swimsuits. The reason why is because it's killed off very easily inside of our hot tubs. But the way a lot of our swimmers interact with the hot tub is when their body overheats, they sit up on the side of the hot tub and they cool off. Once their body temperature cools down, they get back into the hot tub and they leave a puddle behind them on the deck. That puddle will stagnate and Pseudomonas will grow. From there, another swimmer will get up in there, sit inside that puddle, and that Pseudomonas will be transferred to their body. This is why we see those areas of interaction with those puddles as the highest areas of exposure. Like I said, the armpits, the groin area, and the swimsuit area. Making sure that we're keeping our chlorine or bromine up inside of our hot tubs will prevent Pseudomonas from growing inside the hot tubs, but we also need to make sure that we're keeping our decks as dry as possible. Next, let's talk about Legionella or Legionnaire's disease. This is a severe form of pneumonia. Now, one thing that I want you to write down as we talk about this is that second point, but phrase it this way when you write it down, that Legionella is transmitted through water vapor. You can also write down that it's transmitted through water droplets. Now, the reason why we don't write down water droplets inside the presentation is because mists give us a better word picture to work with here. When we say water droplets, we think larger droplets, but really this comes through mists, whether it's a sneeze or it's mists through a water feature, a splash pad, all of the different areas that we can interact with in our facilities. Make sure that we are keeping all of our chlorine levels up above 4 parts per million, not exceeding 5 parts per million. And if we do so, we're going to be killing off Legionella and making sure that nobody is exposed to it. So again, make sure that you are keeping your disinfection levels up and you won't have to worry about Legionnaire's disease. And finally, we've got our chloramines and bromamines. We've talked about these at length in previous sessions, so I won't go into detail again with these, but make sure that we are eliminating those chloramines and bromamines by keeping our air circulation levels up. When you can smell that chlorine in the air, you know you have high levels of bromamines or chloramines. So let's get that air circulation up and we don't have to worry about those. Any questions that you may have during this chapter, make sure you've got them written down so we can address those during the Q&A session. Pool and spa water problems. For this chapter, we're actually going to start on page 79 of our books. We're going to be talking about water issues, primarily colored water issues. Now, discolored water comes from a bunch of different sources. Our fill water can bring mineral content in. Our lawn and landscaping chemicals can kick mineral content in. Our algicides, even corrosion in our pool systems due to poor pool water chemistry can cause our water to discolor. Now let's talk about our most common discoloration inside of our pools. First is going to be green water. Now there's two different types of green water. Cloudy green water is algae. Again, cloudy green water is algae. Clear green water is copper. Now, it's really important that you make the distinction between these two. With cloudy green water, you chlorinate. That's the simple process, is chlorination will kill off algae and clear up your water very quickly. But if your water is clear, it's copper, and you do not want to chlorinate copper ion water. If you chlorinate, it will cause this global scale staining inside of your facility. So make sure that you check if that water is clear or cloudy. If it's cloudy, chlorinate. If it's clear, we recommend using a product called Metal Out or another metal removal product. Making sure that you stay up on that is going to make sure that you don't have any global scale staining like this that requires an entire resurface of your pool to get rid of. Next, we've got reddish brown water. Reddish brown water is caused by iron or manganese in the water itself. You're going to find a photo example of reddish brown water on page 81. Looks like if you filled up a bathtub that has a bad water heater in the house, it gets that brown sooty look to it. Your water inside your pool can have the same issue. Again, we recommend to remove this that you use that product Metal Out or another metal removal agent. Next, let's talk about cloudy water. Cloudy water can be caused by a low flow rate, improper filtration, no disinfectant, and it can also signal early algae growth. Now, some will recommend that you use a clarifier, but a clarifier is not going to address any of the issues that we see on the screen. Like I talked about in an earlier session, I've used maybe 3 bottles of clarifier in the past 24 years of working on swimming pools and spas. Instead, if you follow the next 3 guidelines, you're going to be addressing the problems at the source instead of treating just the symptoms. What you're going to do is you're going to give your facility a good backwash, you're going to chlorinate, and you're going to clean. Backwash, chlorinate, and clean. Backwashing is going to clean out your filter. It's going to bring your flow rate back up. Chlorination is going to kill off any of the algae. It's also going to kill off any of the other potential pathogens inside the water or any of the sources that cause that cloudiness. And cleaning is going to get out the items that could potentially perpetuate that filthiness, that cloudiness. You can also use a clarifier if you want to as a last resort, but like I said, 99.99% of the time, backwashing, chlorinating, and cleaning are going to solve your problem. Now remember, if you can't see the main drain, remember to close your pool. If you can't see the main drain, remember to close the pool. Cloudy water is a health and safety concern. What we're worried about is anybody sinking to the bottom of the pool and us not being able to respond to them because we can't see them. So if you can't see the main drain because the water's so cloudy, close the pool. Next, when it comes to foaming, Foaming is caused by issues such as high total dissolved solids levels, things like our body oils or organic matter that comes off of our body. Even body fat, when it expels itself from the body into hot water, will actually turn itself into foam. So next time we see this kind of activity happening in our hot tubs, we can know that that's not just silly foam that they're putting on their face. That's something like Uncle Lou's body fat that they're putting on their face. To get rid of this, it's an indicator of high levels of total dissolved solids. So remember, to lower our total dissolved solids levels, we are going to replace our water. So when you see high foaming like this, make sure that you're draining your pool or your hot tub. One last note on foaming. This is the type of foaming that we see in this photo caused by high levels of total dissolved solids. There's also foaming that is caused by issues from hair care products. Now, hair care product foaming should not be treated with the draining of the facility. Instead, you're going to want to treat foaming from hair care products with a defoaming agent. The defoaming agent is going to cut through that viscosity that causes those bubbles to occur. And instead, it's going to cut to the source. Whereas if you drain the pool or the hot tub, that surfactant inside of the hair care product can just cling to the walls and then enter the water again once you've filled that pool or hot tub back up. So again, make sure that there's a distinction between hair care product or if it's high TDS levels. You'll be able to know if it's high TDS if you check it with your TDS meter and it's above our aforementioned parameters. Now with algae, we're going to talk about green and black. Green algae is annoying. Black algae is impossible. What we want to do is make sure that we are preventing either one of these from growing in the first place. We're going to get proactive, my friends, instead of reactive. We're going to control this by brushing our walls and floor. The reason why we brush is to be able to churn up that water, make sure that it's kicked up and distributing all of our chlorine equally. We're also going to brush to prevent any of that algae from adhering to the surfaces. Also make sure to keep your chlorine levels up so we can prevent algae from growing. Now, if you need to remove it, it's going to be a hassle. It's going to be a pain in the neck. You can potentially use algicides, but I will say that our algicides are mineral-based, so we have a high risk of discoloration of our water when we use an algicide. So I highly recommend that you go the safest route, which is brushing your walls and floor. 2 walls one day, the next 2 walls another day, and the floor the third day, and then repeat the process. Now let's quickly talk about biofilm. Biofilm looks like scum line. You can also get a biofilm that looks like a transparent jelly covering the surface of your pool. Now, biofilm is dangerous in some situations because it can actually protect bacteria. In fact, in certain situations, that biofilm can take up to 100 parts per million to kill bacteria that's protected by the biofilm itself. So to get rid of this, make sure you're brushing your walls and floor and you're using a tile cleaner regularly inside your facility. Again, 2 walls one day, the other 2 walls another day, the floor the third day, and repeat the process. Be sure to write down any questions that you may have that you thought of during this chapter, and we'll talk about them during the Q&A session. Chapter 13, Spas. Now, Chapter 13 is a short chapter because everything we talked about when it comes to your pools applies to your spas. As we can see, all of our VGB code requirements apply to our spas the exact same way that they do to our pools. So make sure you are following VGB requirements with our hot tubs. Make sure you're performing those regular maintenance checks given to you by your state health code, and make sure that you are documenting those checks. Make sure you have all of your safety equipment installed and ready to be used at any given time with all of your hot tubs and spas. Now, one of the big things you're going to want to write down is make sure that your temperature is no higher than 104 degrees. Take note of that. Maximum temperature, 104 degrees. And I can't stress enough that we maintain those disinfection levels. Maintain those disinfection levels. Now, when it comes to our timers and emergency switches, with our timers, 15 minutes max. We need to make sure that our swimmers are spending no less. We need to make sure that our swimmers are spending no more than 15 minutes in our hot water. Otherwise, their body core temperatures will raise extremely high. Remember that a 150-pound person raises their body core temperature to 102 degrees in 15 minutes' time. Now, as you'll see in the top right corner photo here on my slide, there's something inherently flawed about my timer. That's right, I've given them 30 minutes to sit inside of that hot tub because my timer goes for 30 minutes. This could cause a liability issue, so make sure that your timers go no further than 15 minutes. Also, make sure that that emergency shutoff switch is installed and visible from the hot tub. Also, remember that our small spaces equal a very high threat of disease communication, so we need to make sure that we're keeping those disinfection levels really, really stable. Also, making sure that our shallow water is not going to evaporate disinfectant to the point where we don't have any disinfectant left. Make sure that we are constantly feeding it. Also, make sure that people know the warnings when it comes to medications and hot water. And hyperthermia is a real issue. Remember that with our younger swimmers, the smaller a person gets, the faster that body core temperature is going to rise. This is why on our signage we need to have those age restrictions. Now, the signs of hyperthermia are first and foremost, you fail to recognize how hot the water is. Your body's going to become accustomed to the water. As a result, you're going to say, I don't need to leave the water, this is no big deal. But eventually, you will physically lose your ability to leave the spa itself because your body is so fatigued. Now, this is a scary statistic that women in the first trimester of pregnancy can elevate the chance of self-aborting the child by 75% when immersed in that 104-degree water for 15 minutes like that. This is why on our signage, it needs to say, if you're pregnant or think you're pregnant, please do not use the hot tub. Eventually, somebody can end up losing consciousness, sinking under the surface of the water, and drowning as a result. Again, we need to make sure that people know the threats of sitting in a hot tub. Now, with our chemistry, we've already covered the majority of this. The only things that we haven't covered in previous sessions is that our bromine needs to be between 4 and 6 parts per million. And like we said earlier, our calcium hardness in our hot tubs needs to stay between 150 and 250 parts per million instead of the pool recommendation of 2 to 400 parts per million. Make sure that you write down any questions that you have about your hot tubs so we can talk about them during the Q&A session. Chapter 14, Facility Safety. Now, hopefully by now we recognize that this entire CPO course has focused on health and safety at our properties. We've covered the majority of the information in this chapter elsewhere in this presentation, so I'm just going to go over a few things that we haven't touched on yet, and we will be done very shortly. First and foremost, remember that our gates and barriers, with our barriers, they need to be a minimum of no lower than 60 inches. We've got 60-inch minimums on those barriers. The gates need to be self-closing, self-latching, and ADA compliant. Depending on the nature of the fence, if it's bars, there can be no more than 4 inches of separation on the bars. If it's chain link, there can be no larger than 1.25 inch diamonds. If it's a concrete fence, you can't have any footholds to allow people to get over that fencing. If there's separation between the fence and the ground and it's a soft surface like grass, no more than 2 inches of separation between the grass and that fence bottom. If there's a hard surface like concrete, no more than 2 inches of separation. Now, this is just scratching the surface of the requirements for your fencing. So on our website, we have given the Colorado State Fencing Guidelines link. Go over to our codes and resources page and you'll find it right there to figure out everything that you need to make sure that your gates and barriers are compliant. With lightning storms, make sure you close down. Outdoor facilities especially, lightning storms equal a closure. Indoor facilities, there's no scientific consensus on this, so use your best judgment. If you feel like it's in the best interest of your swimmers, close your facility down indoors. Now, with your chemical storage, we already covered this in a previous section, but we are not allowed to store our chemicals in our pump rooms anymore. Make sure that we are following our MSDS/SDS guidelines and our health department's requirements on this storage. With your PPE, your personal protection equipment, make sure you're wearing it. Again, make sure you're going back to the SDS sheet for that given chemical and you're wearing exactly what is required according to the SDS sheet. And then finally, with your electrical, we're going to talk about lockout tagout procedures very quickly. Now, in a lot of facilities, lockout tagout is going to be a required training that you need documentation that you've actually fulfilled. So don't take this as your final end-all be-all on lockout tagout procedure. But essentially, the process is, let's say I need to use the pool light. With the pool light, I'm going to take my lock with a key that has a tag on it, and I'm going to go to the source of power for that pool light. I'm going to shut off all the breakers that are accompanying that pool area, so there's no power to that area. I'm going to close that junction box, I'm going to lock it up, and I'm going to take the key and the tag with me. I'm going to go fix the pool light, I'm going to go reinstall it, and then once I'm done, I'm going to go unlock that box using my key. I'm going to turn all the power back on. I'm going to close the box up and go hang up my lock, tag, and key back in the maintenance room. That is a very quick and dirty overview of lockout tagout. But when you're using electrical inside of that pool area, make sure that you are practicing proper lockout tagout procedures. We have now reached the end of the presentation, my friends. You may find yourself a little bit overwhelmed at this point, and that's totally normal. We have covered a lot of information. The good news is you will now have the next ensuing weeks to be able to let this unfold. It will start to make sense over time. You'll start to take your time, get some real-world experience, and this will start to become not just applicable in the classroom, but practical at your properties. Also keep in mind that we do provide a 55-point inspection or walkthrough at your property. This walkthrough is comprehensive and goes from the very bottom of the pool to the very top of the facility, making sure that you are as compliant as possible across the board. If you're interested in this service, shoot me an email at alex@pooltrainingacademy.com and we can set up an appointment to come out and check your pool with you in that 55-point inspection. Again, make sure that you have all of your questions compiled that you want to ask during the Q&A session so you'll have those available and ready during that period. Thank you very much, and we will see you in the classrooms.